That rusted piece of junk doesn't belong anywhere near my showroom. The words sliced clean through the polished marble lobby just as Caleb Whitaker stepped out of his faded 1983 Chevy Nova and reached for his daughter's hand. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The fountain beside the glass staircase kept flowing softly. Cameras kept flashing near the red velvet ropes. Somewhere in the distance, a jazz trio played beneath crystal lights worth more than Caleb had earned in the last 5 years. But the people standing outside Hayes Motor Group all turned toward the same thing. The rusty old car with peeling paint parked beside a row of polished Ferraris and custom Bentleys. Caleb quietly shut the creaking driver's door and looked down at Lily. "Stay close to me, sweetheart." The little girl nodded, clutching the sleeve of his weathered denim jacket. Her brown boots were scuffed from years of hand-me-down winters, and the ribbon in her hair had started to fray at the edges. But her eyes still carried that rare kind of belief children only reserve for heroes and fathers. Victoria Hayes descended the front showroom steps like someone born to own every room she entered. Her silver heels clicked sharply against the stone. Tailored white blazer. Diamond earrings. Perfect posture. The kind of woman magazines called untouchable. She glanced once at Caleb's Chevy and smiled without warmth. "Sir, valet parking is around the block," she said smoothly. "Employee deliveries use the rear entrance." A few executives nearby chuckled under their breath. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He simply adjusted Lily's backpack on her shoulder before speaking. "I'm here for the Restoration Division interview." Victoria blinked once, surprised, then let out a quiet laugh that made several people around her join in faster than they meant to. "For restoration?" she asked. "You drove that here?" Derek Sloan stepped forward beside her, expensive watch glinting under the afternoon sun. "Honestly, Miss Hayes, I thought security screened the parking list." More laughter followed. Not loud. Not cruel enough to make headlines. Just enough to remind a man exactly where he stood. Caleb looked at the polished showroom windows reflecting his old Chevy back at him. Rust along the wheel wells. Oxidized chrome. Primer spots on the hood. To everyone else, it looked like a dying machine barely surviving on borrowed miles. But Caleb's eyes softened when he looked at it, the same way people look at old family photographs they can never replace. Lily tugged gently on his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered carefully, "maybe we should go." Caleb crouched beside her slowly, shielding her from the stairs without making a scene. "No, baby girl," he said softly. "Sometimes people only see what's loud and shiny. That doesn't mean they understand value." Victoria crossed her arms. "Mr. Whitaker. Caleb Whitaker." She checked the tablet in her assistant's hands. Her expression shifted slightly. "You're the mechanic from Flagstaff?" "Yes, ma'am." Derek scoffed openly. "This guy restored the Shelby application car." Caleb nodded once. "Part of it." Derek looked back at Victoria with amusement. "You seeing this?" Victoria stepped closer now, studying Caleb with a sharper kind of curiosity. His boots were worn. His knuckles carried old grease stains that no soap ever fully removed. And yet there was something strangely calm about him. No embarrassment. No anger. No desperation. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that made powerful people uncomfortable. Victoria tilted her head slightly toward the Chevy. "Tell me something honestly, Mr. Whitaker," she said. "Why would a man claiming to understand legendary cars drive something that belongs in a scrapyard?" The crowd waited. Cameras lingered. Even the valet attendants slowed to listen. Caleb glanced once at Lily before turning toward the old Chevy. His weathered hand rested lightly against the hood. And when he spoke, his voice was calm enough to silence the wind itself. "Because some machines," he said quietly, "carry stories too valuable to sell." The silence after Caleb Whitaker spoke lingered longer than anyone expected. Not dramatic silence. Not the kind from movies where music stops and glasses freeze midair. This was quieter than that. The uncomfortable kind. The kind that forced people to look again at something they had already decided was worthless. Victoria Hayes held his gaze for another second before stepping back slightly, folding one arm across her waist. Stories do not increase market value, she replied coolly. Condition does. Caleb nodded once. Usually. Derek Sloan smirked and looked around at the guests gathering near the showroom entrance. Investors. Journalists. Influencers holding champagne flutes and luxury phones. You hear that? He laughed. The scrapyard philosopher. A few people laughed again, though weaker this time. Caleb ignored all of them. He reached into the back seat of the Chevy and pulled out a folded denim blanket for Lily. The evening breeze had started rolling down from the hills outside Scottsdale, and the little girl rubbed her hands together against the chill. Caleb wrapped the blanket gently around her shoulders before kneeling to zip her jacket all the way up. You warm enough? Lily nodded softly. Yes, Daddy. Victoria watched the exchange without meaning to. Something about it disrupted the clean rhythm of the event she had spent months preparing. The cameras. The speeches. The polished image of power. Caleb did not fit into any of it, yet somehow he stood there without shrinking. Derek leaned closer to Victoria. You want me to have security move him? He asked quietly. Guests are starting to stare. Victoria looked toward the old Chevy again. The oxidized hood reflected the golden showroom lights in uneven streaks. It looked tired. Ancient. Forgotten. But Caleb treated the car with the same care he showed his daughter. Like both deserved dignity no matter how worn they appeared. No, Victoria said finally. I want to know why he is here. Caleb rose slowly as she approached him again. Your application says you rebuilt a 1965 Shelby Cobra transmission by hand. Yes, ma'am. Without formal engineering school. I learned from my father. Derek scoffed again. Of course he did. Caleb kept his eyes steady. My father restored racing engines for collectors before he passed. And now? Victoria asked. Caleb glanced briefly at Lily beside him. Now I fix pickups, tractors, and whatever keeps the lights on. The honesty in his voice carried no self-pity. That unsettled Victoria more than arrogance would have. Most people who stood before her either begged for approval or tried too hard to impress her. Caleb did neither. The valet nearby accidentally dropped a set of Porsche keys, and the sharp metallic clatter echoed across the marble entrance. Lily flinched slightly. Caleb instinctively rested a hand on her shoulder. Easy, sweetheart. Victoria noticed the child studying the Ferraris lined beneath the showroom lights. Bright red paint. Sculpted Italian curves. Machines built for wealth most people would never touch. You like cars? Victoria asked unexpectedly. Lily hesitated, then nodded. Daddy says every car has a heartbeat if you listen long enough. Derek laughed openly this time. That is adorable. Caleb did not react to the sarcasm. He simply looked down at Lily with tired but patient eyes. What else did I tell you? Lily looked up at him carefully before answering. That people who love machines should never laugh at old ones. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Even the nearby conversation softened for a moment. Somewhere inside the showroom, a piano melody drifted through hidden speakers while sunlight faded behind the desert skyline. Victoria crossed her arms tighter. She should have walked away already. She should have returned to the investors waiting inside. Instead, she found herself staring at the rusted Chevy again, trying to understand why a man struggling to survive would protect a dying machine like it carried something sacred beneath the steel. Then Derek suddenly smiled with the dangerous excitement of a man about to entertain a crowd. Tell you what, Whitaker," he announced loudly enough for the nearby guests to hear. "If that heap of metal can start clean on the first try right now, Miss Hayes lets you walk into the interview personally." He paused, grinning as more people turned to watch. "But if it does not, security pushes it off the property." For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The desert wind drifted softly through the open valet lane, carrying the scent of warm asphalt, expensive perfume, and old engine oil from Caleb Whitaker's Chevy. Derek. Sloane stood with his hands in his pockets, smiling like a man already certain of the outcome. "Well?" he asked loudly. "You heard the deal." More guests slowly gathered near the entrance now, drawn by the tension the way people gather around street musicians or accidents they pretend not to enjoy watching. A few raised phones discreetly. Others whispered behind champagne glasses. Victoria Hayes should have stopped it. She knew that. This was supposed to be a refined launch event for the restoration division of Hayes Motor Group, not a public humiliation outside the front doors. And yet she remained still, curious despite herself. Caleb looked toward Lily first. Always Lily. The little girl stood quietly beside him wrapped in her denim blanket, her fingers curled tightly around the strap of her backpack. "Daddy," she whispered carefully, "you do not have to." Caleb gave her a faint smile. "It is okay, sweetheart." Then he looked toward Derek. "You really want to make a show out of this?" Derek shrugged. "People love underdog stories." A few nearby investors laughed softly. Caleb glanced once toward Victoria. "And you?" Victoria held his gaze evenly. "I want to know whether you belong inside my building." The words landed cold and precise. Caleb nodded slowly, almost like he respected honesty more than kindness. Then without another word, he walked toward the old Chevy. The crowd instinctively parted around him. His boots echoed softly against the polished stone as the evening lights reflected across the faded body panels of the car. Up close, every scar on the vehicle told its age. Thin fractures in the paint. Tiny dents near the rear bumper. Rust curling beneath chrome trim like dried autumn leaves. To most people there, it looked tired beyond saving. But Caleb touched the driver's door gently before opening it, and somehow even that simple movement carried respect. He slid behind the wheel slowly. The seat springs creaked beneath his weight. Inside the car, the dashboard glowed dim amber beneath cracked glass gauges worn smooth by decades of hands and miles. Caleb rested both hands on the steering wheel for one quiet second, eyes lowered. The crowd outside waited impatiently. Derek checked his watch theatrically. "Come on, Whitaker. We do not have all night." Caleb ignored him. He turned the key once. The engine coughed hard. A rough metallic shudder rolled through the frame before the sound died instantly. Laughter broke across the entrance almost immediately. Not cruel enough to shock anyone. Just loud enough to sting. Derek spread his hands dramatically. "And there it is." Even some of the valets smiled awkwardly. Victoria crossed her arms, disappointment flickering briefly across her face though she did not fully understand why. Lily looked down at the ground, embarrassed for the first time all evening. But Caleb did not react. He remained perfectly still behind the wheel, listening. Not trying again. Just listening. The crowd slowly quieted as the silence stretched strangely long. Caleb's fingers moved lightly across the steering wheel. Then his eyes shifted toward the hood. "That is interesting," he murmured softly to himself. Victoria stepped forward slightly. "What?" Caleb turned the key again, but only halfway this time. A faint vibration trembled through the engine compartment. Barely noticeable. Caleb closed his eyes for one brief second. The showroom lights reflected across his tired face while the low mechanical hum vibrated through the old frame beneath him like a heartbeat struggling to speak. Then Caleb opened his eyes and quietly stepped back out of the car. Derek laughed again. "What now?" Going to pray over it? Caleb looked calmly toward the front of the Chevy. No, he said softly. I am going to fix what somebody touched. The laughter faded almost instantly. Victoria's expression sharpened. Touched? Caleb walked slowly toward the hood, every eye following him now. This engine was not failing, he said quietly. It was interrupted. The crowd leaned closer without realizing it. Conversations near the showroom entrance faded one by one until the only sounds left were the soft trickle of the marble fountain and the low desert wind moving through the valet lane. Caleb Whitaker stood beside the open hood of the Chevy with the calm patience of a man who had spent most of his life listening more than speaking. Derek Sloan folded his arms tightly. Interrupted by who? He asked with a mocking grin. Caleb did not answer immediately. He reached into the front pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a small flashlight no bigger than his palm. The metal casing was scratched from years of use. He clicked it on and leaned carefully over the engine compartment while the yellow beam cut through layers of dust and shadow. Victoria Hayes stepped closer despite herself. The smell of warm oil and old steel drifted upward beneath the showroom lights. To her surprise, the engine bay was not neglected chaos the way she expected. It was aged, yes. Weathered. But organized with an almost obsessive precision. Every wire sat exactly where it should. Every hose looked measured by hand. Even the old bolts carried faint polishing marks. Caleb moved slowly, fingers tracing along the distributor cap. Then he stopped. There. His voice was quiet but certain. Derek rolled his eyes. Amazing. The mechanic found a mechanic problem. Caleb gently lifted a thin ignition wire. It had been loosened just enough to interrupt the firing sequence without appearing obvious. A tiny adjustment. Deliberate. Victoria frowned. That could happen naturally. Caleb shook his head once. Not on this engine. The confidence in his answer unsettled her again. Not arrogance. Just certainty earned through experience. Caleb tightened the wire carefully with 2 fingers, then paused. His eyes narrowed slightly toward the rear side of the engine block. Something else had caught his attention. Lily stood quietly beside the front tire now, watching her father with complete trust. Daddy, she asked softly. What is it? Caleb stared into the shadows beneath the hood for another second before speaking. Somebody polished this recently. Derek laughed again. Now you are seeing ghosts. But Caleb was already reaching deeper into the engine bay. The sleeve of his denim jacket brushed against old metal while the flashlight beam revealed a narrow section beneath years of grime where the surface looked strangely cleaner than the rest. Not polished bright. Just disturbed. Like someone had wiped across it. Recently with a cloth. Victoria stepped closer instinctively. Her expensive heels clicked softly against the pavement. Move the light, she said quietly. Caleb adjusted the flashlight angle without speaking. The crowd around them had grown completely silent now. Even the valet attendants had stopped pretending to work. Caleb grabbed a rag from inside the Chevy and slowly wiped across the dark metal surface. Oil smeared across the cloth in thick black streaks. The first pass revealed almost nothing. The second uncovered faint lettering pressed into the engine casing itself. Derek squinted. What is that supposed to be? Caleb did not answer. Victoria leaned closer. Her perfume mixed strangely with the scent of gasoline and heat rising from the old engine. Caleb wiped the surface one final time. The overhead lights reflected faintly across engraved metal hidden beneath decades of grime. Then the entire atmosphere changed. Victoria's breath caught so suddenly she forgot to hide it. Her eyes locked onto the inscription as the color slowly drained from her face. Derek looked confused. What? Victoria took another step forward, almost disbelieving what she was seeing. The engraved script was elegant. Hand-cut. Italian. Old enough to belong in museums instead of junkyards. Caleb lowered the rags slowly while the flashlight beam trembled faintly against the metal surface. The crowd waited in complete silence. Victoria stared at the engine like someone standing face to face with a ghost from automotive history itself. Then, barely above a whisper, she spoke the words nobody there expected to hear. "That signature," her voice tightened. "That cannot be real." Nobody laughed anymore. The crowd that had gathered outside Hayes Motor Group stood frozen beneath the gold showroom lights while Victoria Hayes stared into the engine compartment as if the laws of reality had suddenly bent in front of her. Derek Sloan frowned impatiently. "Would somebody explain what we are looking at?" Victoria did not answer him right away. Her eyes remained locked on the engraved signature hidden inside the engine block. Elegant cursive etched directly into aged aluminum. Impossible to fake. Convincingly. Impossible to ignore if you truly understood automotive history. Caleb Whitaker quietly stepped back to give her space. He did not look proud. He did not look triumphant. That unsettled Victoria more than anything else. Most men would have enjoyed this moment. Most men would have savored the silence after humiliation. Caleb simply waited. The desert air drifted softly across the open hood while distant traffic hummed somewhere beyond the hills of Scottsdale. Victoria finally spoke, her voice lower now. "Do you understand what this says?" Derek scoffed. "It says somebody scratched Italian nonsense into an old engine." Victoria turned toward him sharply for the first time all evening. "No," she said quietly. "It says Enzo Ferrari personally approved this block." The words hit the crowd like a sudden change in weather. Several guests exchanged confused glances. One older investor near the valet lane slowly lowered his champagne glass. "That is not possible," Derek snapped immediately. "Ferrari never signed engines like that." "Not publicly," Victoria replied. Her breathing had changed slightly now, controlled but uneven beneath her composed exterior. "But there were rumors in the late 1960s. Experimental prototypes. Hand-tuned endurance blocks built outside standard production." She looked back toward the engine again. "Collectors have searched for them for decades." Caleb remained silent. Lily looked up at her father with wide eyes. "Daddy," she whispered softly. "What does that mean?" Caleb gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "It means Grandpa was telling the truth." Victoria's eyes shifted toward him immediately. "Your father knew about this?" Caleb nodded once. "He spent years restoring racing engines in Medina before I was born." Derek laughed nervously now, trying to pull control of the moment back toward himself. "Okay, hold on. Anybody can invent a story." Caleb calmly reached into the glove compartment and removed a faded leather folder wrapped carefully in cloth. The edges were worn smooth with age. He handed it to Victoria without hesitation. Inside were yellowed photographs. Old shipping manifests. Restoration notes written. Partly in Italian. And one black and white photograph of a younger man standing beside a Ferrari test team in northern Italy nearly 40 years earlier. Victoria's eyes widened further with every page she turned. "Frank Whitaker," she read quietly from the back of one photo. "Engine specialist." Caleb nodded. "My father." The crowd had completely transformed now. The same people who laughed at Caleb less than 20 minutes earlier leaned forward with fascination and disbelief. The showroom lights reflected across expensive watches and polished shoes while everyone stared at the rusted Chevy like it had suddenly become sacred. Derek's smile had disappeared entirely. "Even if this is authentic," he said carefully, "why would something like that end up inside this car?" Caleb looked toward the old Chevy with quiet affection. "Because my father hid it." Victoria looked up sharply. "Why?" Caleb paused for a moment. His tired eyes drifted briefly toward Lily before returning to the engine. "Because some people wanted to sell it," he said softly. And my father believed certain things should stay with families instead of collectors. The evening wind moved through the valet lane again, carrying the smell of dust and gasoline beneath the soft glow of showroom chandeliers. Victoria closed the leather folder slowly, almost reverently. For the first time that night, the powerful CEO standing beneath million-dollar lights no longer looked untouchable. She looked humbled. Then Caleb quietly reached into the engine bay once more, tightened the final connection by hand, and said the words that made every heartbeat around him pause. "Now," he said calmly, "listen carefully to what real history sounds like when it wakes up." The entire valet lane stood still as Caleb Whitaker slid back into the driver's seat of the old Chevy. Nobody checked their phones anymore. Nobody laughed. The investors near the showroom entrance leaned forward silently while the Arizona evening settled around them in warm gold and shadow. Victoria Hayes remained beside the open hood, her eyes fixed on the engine block that should not have existed beneath layers of rust and faded paint. Caleb rested his weathered hands on the steering wheel again, but this time the movement carried something almost ceremonial. Lily stood near the front tire holding her blanket tightly against the breeze. "Daddy," she whispered softly, "is Grandpa watching?" Caleb looked at her through the windshield and smiled faintly. "I think he never stopped." Then he turned the key. At first there was only silence. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then the engine awakened. Not violently. Not loudly. Smooth. Deep. Alive. A rich mechanical note rolled through the night air like distant thunder softened by velvet. The vibration moved through the pavement beneath everyone's feet. Conversation stopped inside the showroom itself as heads turned toward the sound outside. Several guests instinctively held their breath. Because this was not the sound of an old dying engine. This was precision. Balance. Craftsmanship from another era entirely. Caleb lightly pressed the accelerator once. The engine answered instantly with a clean rising growl that echoed softly against the glass walls of Hayes Motor Group. Somewhere behind the crowd, an older collector muttered under his breath, "Dear God." Victoria stared through the open hood in disbelief. She had spent her entire life around rare machines. Limited production Ferraris. Vintage Bugattis. Custom Aston Martins. But she had never heard anything like this hidden beneath the body of an exhausted Chevy Nova parked outside a luxury showroom. Caleb slowly shut the engine off again. The sudden silence afterward somehow felt louder. Derek Sloan recovered first. "Okay," he said quickly, forcing out a laugh. "Cute trick. But if this thing is really worth millions, why drive it around like a junkyard relic?" The question hung heavily in the warm night air. Caleb stepped out of the Chevy slowly and closed the driver's door with care. He looked toward the fading desert horizon before answering. "Because my daughter needed a father more than I needed money." Nobody moved. Caleb leaned lightly against the old Chevy now, his fingers brushing the worn paint near the hood. "After my wife passed away," he continued quietly, "hospital bills took everything. The garage. The house. Savings. Most of the collectors my father once worked with offered to buy the engine after they heard rumors." Victoria listened without interrupting. Caleb's voice remained calm, but there was an exhaustion beneath it now older than simple poverty. "One man offered me $4 million 3 years ago." Derek blinked hard. Several people in the crowd gasped quietly. Victoria stared at Caleb. "And you refused?" Caleb nodded once. Lily was 6. He looked down at his daughter gently. "She used to fall asleep in the back seat while I worked night jobs. Sometimes this car was the only roof we had for a while." Lily lowered her eyes shyly, embarrassed by the attention. Caleb smiled softly at her. But she never complained. Not once. The wind shifted through the valet lane again, carrying the faint scent of rain somewhere far beyond the city lights. Victoria suddenly looked at the Chevy differently now. The worn seats. The faded dashboard. The patched paint. None of it looked pathetic anymore. It looked lived in. Protected. Loved. Caleb reached into the back seat and carefully pulled out a small folded photograph tucked near the center console. He handed it toward Victoria. It showed a younger Frank Whitaker standing beside the same engine decades earlier, smiling proudly with grease on his hands. Beside him stood a little boy no older than 8 holding a wrench too large for his small fingers. Caleb. My father used to tell me something, Caleb said quietly. He said real craftsmanship is not about showing wealth. It is about leaving dignity behind in the things you build. Victoria looked from the photograph back to Caleb. The powerful CEO who had mocked his car less than an hour earlier now stood completely speechless beneath the glow of her own showroom lights. And somewhere deep inside her, something uncomfortable had begun to crack. The silence after Caleb Whitaker finished speaking carried a different weight now. It was no longer the silence of mockery. It was reflection. Beneath the glowing lights of Hayes Motor Group, wealthy investors and executives stood staring at the old Chevy with expressions that no longer matched the polished confidence they arrived with earlier that evening. Victoria Hayes still held the faded photograph carefully in her hands. Her thumb brushed lightly across the worn edges while she studied the younger version of Caleb standing beside his father in Italy. Grease on their hands. Pride in their eyes. No luxury. No fame. Just craft. Derek Sloan broke the silence first. Well, he said sharply, forcing energy back into the crowd, this changes things. Caleb looked toward him calmly. Derek straightened his expensive suit jacket and stepped closer to the Chevy, but this time his eyes did not carry contempt. They carried hunger. You realize what this means, right? He said quickly. Do you have any idea what collectors would pay for a verified Ferrari prototype block? Caleb did not answer. Derek continued anyway, words speeding up with excitement. This could headline auctions in Monterey, Geneva, Dubai. Every automotive museum in the world would fight for it. Victoria slowly lowered the photograph. Derek. But he barely heard her now. You are sitting on a fortune, Whitaker. He pointed toward the engine. That thing does not belong inside a beat-up Nova parked outside a dealership. Caleb rested one hand gently against the Chevy's roof. It belongs with my family. Derek laughed softly like he could not believe what he was hearing. Sentiment does not pay bills. Caleb's eyes hardened slightly for the first time all evening. Not anger. Resolve. It paid enough. The words landed quietly, but they stopped Derek cold for a second. Lily moved closer beside her father, small fingers wrapping around his hand again. Victoria noticed the movement immediately. The little girl had spent the entire evening watching adults measure human worth through money, status, and appearances. Yet somehow she still looked at her father like the richest man alive. Derek recovered quickly. Listen, he said, lowering his voice into something smoother now. I can connect you with buyers tonight. Serious buyers. You could walk away with enough money to change your life forever. Caleb shook his head once. My life already changed the day my daughter survived losing her mother. Derek's smile faded. You are being emotional. No, Caleb replied softly. I am being loyal. The wind swept through the valet lane again, stirring Lily's ribbon gently beneath the showroom lights. Somewhere inside the building, the jazz trio had stopped playing entirely. Even they were listening now. Victoria stepped closer toward Derek. That is enough. He looked at her in disbelief. Enough? Victoria, this is history sitting under rust. We cannot let him drive away with it. Caleb quietly closed the hood of the Chevy. The sound echoed softly through the night like the closing of a vault. You do not get to decide what belongs to me, he said calmly. Derek's jaw tightened. You are making a mistake. Caleb looked directly at him now. Maybe. Then his eyes shifted briefly toward Lily before returning to Derek. But my daughter will grow up knowing her father never sold his family's soul for applause. Nobody spoke after that. Victoria felt something painful twist quietly in her chest because she realized Derek was not the only person being exposed tonight. She remembered her own words earlier. Scrapyard. Junk. Does not belong near my showroom. The memory suddenly sounded ugly in her mind. Not because Caleb proved her wrong. Because he never tried to humiliate her back. That was the part she could not escape. Caleb had every reason to embarrass the people who mocked him. Instead, he protected his dignity the same way he protected his daughter and that old Chevy. Quietly. Without cruelty. Victoria looked toward Derek again, and for the first time in years, she saw something in her own executive team she had ignored too long. Men who respected value only after wealth validated it. Men who laughed first and listened later. Derek took one final step toward Caleb. At least tell me one thing, he said carefully. Why hide something this important inside an old family car? Caleb opened the driver's door slowly and looked back over his shoulder. The showroom lights reflected softly in his tired eyes. Because the world stops respecting beautiful things the moment money teaches people to own them instead of love them. For several long seconds after Caleb Whitaker spoke, nobody around the valet lane seemed to know what to say. The showroom lights glowed against polished Ferraris and marble columns while the old Chevy sat quietly among them like something stubborn enough to survive an entire world built to dismiss it. Victoria Hayes watched Caleb open the driver's door again, and for the first time that evening, panic brushed faintly through her chest. Not panic about the engine. About him leaving. Mr. Whitaker, she said suddenly. Caleb paused. His hand rested lightly on the door frame as he turned toward her. The crowd shifted quietly, sensing something changing beneath the surface of the evening. Victoria stepped forward slowly, her silver heels softer now against the pavement than before. Please, she said carefully. Do not go yet. Derek looked stunned. Victoria, come on. She ignored him completely. Her eyes remained fixed on Caleb. I owe you an apology. The words landed harder than shouting would have. Investors exchanged glances. Employees near the entrance lowered their eyes. Powerful people rarely apologized publicly, especially not people like Victoria Hayes. Caleb studied her silently for a moment. The desert wind moved gently through his graying hair while Lily stood beside him holding his hand. Victoria drew a breath before continuing. When you arrived tonight, I saw an old car and assumed I understood the man driving it. Her voice tightened slightly. I was wrong. Caleb looked down briefly, almost uncomfortable receiving honesty after an entire evening of ridicule. Most people would have. That does not excuse it. The silence that followed felt strangely human now. No cameras flashing. No mocking laughter. Just truth standing quietly beneath expensive lights. Derek stepped closer, lowering his voice sharply toward Victoria. You cannot seriously be doing this in front of investors. Victoria finally turned toward him. Doing what? Handing control of the room to some mechanic with a hidden engine. Caleb immediately spoke before the tension could rise further. I never wanted control of your room. Derek scoffed. Then why come here? Caleb looked at Lily for a brief second before answering. Because my daughter deserves to see her father keep trying. The word struck the crowd with painful simplicity. Victoria glanced toward Lily, noticing the little girl staring up at Caleb with complete admiration. No embarrassment. No fear. Just trust. The kind money could never purchase. Victoria slowly looked around at the people gathered near the entrance. Luxury watches. Tailored suits. Diamond bracelets reflecting chandelier light. And yet somehow the poorest person there had carried the most dignity all night. She turned back toward Caleb. Your application said you specialized in restoration work. Caleb nodded once. Mostly older American engines. You rebuilt this one too. Caleb glanced toward the Chevy. My father started teaching me when I was 8 years old. Victoria folded her arms lightly, but this time not as armor. More like someone trying to hold a difficult realization together. You kept a machine collectors would fight wars over hidden inside a family car for decades. Caleb smiled faintly. Cars are easier to protect than people. The sentence lingered heavily between them. Victoria noticed the exhaustion in his face more clearly now. Long nights. Financial strain. Grief carried quietly instead of loudly displayed. And somehow through all of it, he still chose gentleness. Derek suddenly pulled out his phone. Enough emotion, he muttered. I already texted a private buyer in Los Angeles. If Whitaker wants real money, we can settle this tonight. Caleb's expression hardened immediately. I said no. Derek shrugged carelessly. Everybody says no until they hear the number. Victoria's eyes narrowed. You contacted buyers without permission. I am trying to protect company interests. It is not our engine, Victoria replied coldly. Derek opened his mouth again, but she cut him off before he could speak. And neither is his life. The word stunned him silent. Caleb quietly opened the back seat of the Chevy and helped Lily climb inside. He wrapped the old denim blanket gently around her shoulders before closing the door softly behind her. Then he stood there for a moment beneath the glowing lights of Hayes Motor Group with one hand resting on the roof of the car that had carried his family through grief, poverty, and survival. Victoria watched him carefully. And suddenly she understood something that made her chest ache in ways quarterly profits never could. Caleb Whitaker never walked into her showroom searching for wealth. He walked in searching for respect. The night air outside Hayes Motor Group had grown cooler by the time the crowd finally began to understand they were witnessing something far more valuable than an unveiling event for luxury cars. Beneath towering glass walls and million-dollar chandeliers, the old Chevy remained parked quietly at the center of attention while Caleb Whitaker stood beside it with one hand resting gently near the driver's door. Lily had fallen half asleep in the back seat beneath her blanket, her small face peaceful beneath the soft amber glow of the dashboard lights. Victoria Hayes looked at the child for a long moment before speaking again. Mr. Whitaker, she said quietly, would you give me one chance to make this right? Caleb studied her carefully. The arrogance from earlier was gone now. No performance. No polished executive mask. Just sincerity standing uncomfortably in expensive heels. Derek Sloan exhaled sharply in frustration. Victoria, this is becoming ridiculous. She turned toward him slowly. No, she replied. What was ridiculous was laughing at a man because his car looked older than our assumptions. Several employees near the entrance lowered their eyes immediately. Nobody defended Derek anymore. Victoria stepped closer to Caleb and reached into the pocket of her white blazer. She removed a black access card embossed with the silver Hayes Motor Group insignia. Tomorrow morning, she said softly, I want you inside our restoration division. Caleb frowned slightly. For an interview? Victoria shook her head once. For a position. The crowd murmured quietly. Derek stared at her in disbelief. You cannot be serious. Victoria's eyes never left Caleb. I have spent years searching for mechanics who understand legacy. Her voice tightened faintly. Tonight I realized legacy has nothing to do with wealth. It has to do with what survives hardship without losing dignity. Caleb looked down briefly, almost overwhelmed by the sudden shift in the evening. Miss Hayes, I did not come here expecting favors. Good, she replied gently. Because respect is not a favor. Silence settled over the valet lane again, but this time it felt warm instead of cruel. The fountain beside the marble staircase continued flowing softly while distant city lights shimmered against the dark Arizona hills. Victoria glanced toward the old Chevy one more time. "Do you know what the strangest part of tonight is?" Caleb shook his head. She smiled faintly for the first time all evening, but there was sadness inside it now. "I built an empire around rare cars. Yet the most valuable machine I have ever seen arrived covered in rust." Caleb looked toward the Chevy quietly. "Rust just means something survived long enough to earn scars." The word settled deeply into the hearts of everyone listening. Derek looked away entirely now, embarrassed in a way no public argument could have achieved. Victoria slowly stepped toward the back seat window where Lily slept curled beneath her blanket. "Your daughter believes in you completely," she whispered. Caleb's tired eyes softened instantly. "She is the reason I kept going." Victoria nodded slowly. "Then she already made you richer than most people here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. No cameras flashed. No reporters interrupted. The night had become strangely sacred around the old Chevy and the quiet man standing beside it. Then Victoria extended the access card toward Caleb once more. "Please," she said softly. "Come help us restore cars the way your father taught you. Not for auctions. Not for headlines. For history." Caleb looked at the card for several long seconds before carefully accepting it. The crowd near the entrance began applauding quietly at first. Then louder. Not because of the engine anymore. Not because of the hidden Ferrari signature or the rumors of millions buried beneath steel. They applauded because somewhere between the mocking laughter and the silence that followed, they had been reminded of something the world often forgets. A person's value is not revealed by polish, wealth, or appearances. Sometimes it arrives in faded denim beside an old family car carrying everything a father refused to sell away. Caleb opened the driver's door gently and looked back toward Victoria one final time before climbing inside. "My father used to say something," he said softly through the open window. Victoria stepped closer to hear him. Caleb smiled faintly while the dashboard lights reflected warmly across his weathered face. "The world eventually hears the truth," he said. "But first, it usually laughs at it." Then the old Chevy rolled quietly away beneath the glowing lights of Hayes Motor Group, leaving behind a silence no one there would ever forget.